Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this webinar, Values-Based Messaging, Using Words That Work. My name is Ingrid Krasnow. I'm with Berkeley Media Studies Group, and I'm excited to welcome you to this webinar supported by the California Wellness Foundation. We will be conducting this webinar together, my colleague Shaddai Martinez-Cuestas and I, for the next hour. We'll have a number of hands-on activities as well as a Q&A session at the end. Feel free to send in questions via the chat box in advance if you do have them, but we will have a formal Q&A session at the end.
Hi, everyone, and this is Shaddai. And before we get started, we just want to tell you a little bit more about Berkeley Media Studies Group. Some of you might be familiar with us, but for those of you who are not, we're mainly focused on three areas in our work. The first one is doing research and news analysis on how public health issues and social justice issues are covered in the media. Number two is we do media advocacy training and strategic consultations for community groups, such as today. So today is part of our training capacity building work that we do with groups and health advocates. And then we also are working with journalists to improve the way that health and social justice issues are covered in the media. And we just want to mention that we are a project of the Public Health Institute. So a couple of technical assistance, technical issues. If you have any technical difficulties, you can call WebEx directly at the number. Please write it down because it will go away when we advance the slides. So the number is 1-866-229-3239. And you can also send a message to Heather through the chat box. And speaking about the chat box, you can see it on the bottom right corner of your screen. And when you try to send a message to Heather, you can select Heather's name from it. But if not, always select all participants. That's the only way everybody can see. Do not select all attendees because otherwise we won't be able to see it. So I think that's pretty much it in terms of technical assistance. I'm passing it back to Ingrid.
Thanks, Shaddai. We just wanted to say a little bit about who we are and our work with Berkeley Media Studies Group. So again, my name is Ingrid Krasnow. I've been with BMSG for about 10 years and enjoy doing work remotely via webinar as well as in-person trainings in California and across the country. My background has been historically in reproductive justice issues and advocacy, although since working with BMSG, I've been working on sort of the whole spectrum of public health and social justice issues. Shaddai, would you like to say a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So I'm Shaddai Martinez-Cuestas, and I recently joined BMSG, and my background is in community health. I was working at a federally qualified health center in San Francisco, primarily in the area of HIV care and HIV prevention. So I'm excited to be shifting gears here and looking at a bigger public health perspective.
Thanks, Shaddai. So our goals for today are three primary goals. One is really focusing on the role of values in your messaging. So what are the values of your particular audience and what are your values and how do those two concepts align in order to influence your message and your audience? How are you framing your message? You know, we have a lot of choices when framing our messages, so what can you be strategic about in your framing to ensure that values are a part of your framing and that they're going to resonate with your target audience? And then what are the key components of a message? We're going to spend some time breaking down sort of the basic components of an effective message and actually give you some opportunities to practice writing effective messages, just short messages, and also review the idea that messages that we review in today's webinar can be, the format that we're going to talk about can really be used in a number of different types of messaging and types of mediums, so we'll review that as well. But we wanted to start off today just to get our brains thinking around this idea of values with understanding what are some of the values that inspire you to do your work. Everyone who's with us here on the phone and participating in this webinar, we know that your work is inspired by the missions of your organization, and we'd love to hear from you. What are some of those values that get you up every day and inspire you to do the good work that you're doing? You can just enter your answers into the chat box, again, using all participants so that both attendees and the panelists can see your messages. So let's give you a moment to do that. Great. So we have a number of values sort of coming through the feed now. So I saw social justice, equity, community accountability, cultural responsiveness, equity, inclusion, dignity. These are all values that I think could resonate with all of us.
Family.
Family, thank you. Workforce development, that's great. And I'm sure it's hard to just choose a few when there are a number of different things that inspire all of us to do the work that we're doing. Fairness and human development. Great. Well, I just want to say thank you for sharing all of these. Continue to send them if you'd like. And just keep these in mind as we're going through today's webinar, because this is going to be sort of the core of what we're talking about, both the values that inspire you as well as connecting with the values of your target audience. So Shaddai is going to lead us in our next activity, which has to do with thinking about framing. Shaddai?
Yes, and we just want to discuss this concept of framing before we talk about our messages and before we talk about developing our message. We need to understand this concept of framing, and so also just take a moment to look at the image in the slide and think about what kind of information you're getting about this person and about what's happening in this. And so if you want to also write down something or just think about what you can see in this picture. And some isolation, so we see a person alone. They're somewhere inside. They're pointing outside. It's obscure. We don't know if it's a man or a woman. It looks like a woman. We can't really tell. So some of us can see that the person has glasses, that has a sweater, is reacting. We don't have a lot of information about what's happening in this picture and what's happening with this woman. And the idea of framing is that when we have a portrait frame like this picture, we can only see certain things about the person or about what the situation. And we have mental frames in our heads that we use to make sense of the world. And like a portrait picture, our default frame in this society and in this culture is to really focus on the individual, really focus on the person that's in front of us, and not so much what's surrounding us. So if we look at the wider picture or the landscape picture, we can learn a lot more about what's going on surrounding that person. And this a lot of the times has a lot to do with what's happening with people's health. And we can see that there's a lot of things that are outside of people's control that can have a big impact on their health. And I think this is really important for everyone working towards health equity and social justice, that our job is to bring this frame into the picture, to widen that frame, and to make sure that when we are developing messages that we include what else is happening, so that the responsibility is not just put in on the individual, but it takes into account what's happening around the individuals. So this is just a framing 101 in 3 minutes, but we wanted to show this because this is really important, and it is hard for us as health advocates because the default frame in our society is to look at an individual. So we always need to make sure we bring it back and look at what's happening around. So we're here to talk about messaging, and what we want to say is that any messages that you develop are going to be grounded in your overall strategy. So your message is never going to come first. So you need to ask yourself more questions to know exactly what you're going to do to change whatever you're trying to change, how you're going to do it, and why you want it to be changed in order to inform your message. So your message is going to come after that. And this leads us to our layers of strategy. So at BMSG, we have these layers of strategy to help advocates and groups think through their actions and their advocacy work to make sure that it is guided, it is focused, and it is strategic. So what we wanted to focus on today is the message strategy. As you can see, is the number 3 and going down. But I do want to talk a little bit about our overall strategy, because that's the answer to those questions are really going to guide your message. So when talking about an overall strategy, we need to think about what is the problem that we want to solve. And when we talk about our problem, we need to be specific, because that's usually what leads into a solution, of what kind of solutions are going to come out. So number 2 will be to clarify the solutions that you're proposing. Number 3 is identifying who has the power to make that change. So who's that body, that entity, that group of people who have that ability to make the change that you want, to change that policy, to vote, or to do whatever you want them to do. So this usually is the target of your message. Number 4, we have the list of stakeholders who can help you. So these are your allies and who can be mobilized to support the change that you're trying to make. So they can be partners, donors, community groups, participants, or anybody else who you think needs to be mobilized to support your policy actions are going to be. And lastly is identify what are you going to do. Identify what steps you're going to take to influence your target. Without going much in depth into all the other layers, because that'll take a lot more time, we just want to emphasize that messages will never come first, that you need to have an overall strategy where your message is going to be grounded. So I'm just going to pass it on to Ingrid to talk a little bit more about values, because we've been talking a lot about values, and that's the main topic of today's presentation.
Thanks, Shaddai. So with that foundation around message strategy and really grounding your message strategy as a component of your overall strategy, we want to move on to why values are so important. So the way that we think about values is really to hold your audience accountable to their own values and to the socially accepted values that we all share. So what this requires is that we need to know what our values are and who are the people we're holding accountable and what are their values. So we're not trying to convince them necessarily of our position on a certain issue, although obviously that's a benefit. But we really want to say, hey, we share these values in our society or within these certain groups or in this relationship, and we need to hold you accountable to act within those values. And so that's where we're going to take our work today. But we wanted to make sure that it was clear that the messaging and the values-based messaging that we're going to talk about can really be used in any kind of medium. So whether you're doing an interview with the print media or broadcast media, and you're looking for a message development strategy for those kinds of interviews, this can be effective there. It can also be helpful for social media. So whether you're using, Twitter and you have a really short amount of space, a little amount of space, or you have Facebook or another kind of channel where you have more space, this structure that we're going to be presenting today can be used for really any type of medium. And not only in advancing your messaging and advancing your policy change goals, but also in sort of the functioning of your organization, in your grant writing, annual reports, or donor development. This kind of structured message can also be really effective. So we hope that you'll take this into your work in all different facets and make some good use of it. And so we're going to get to the message structure in just a little while, but we want to dig into, at this point, really the idea around values and why it's so important to hold your audience accountable, but also what are we dealing with in terms of competing values within our society. So I mentioned earlier in the presentation that oftentimes in our culture, in the United States in particular, in mainstream culture, our default frame and our default value is really on the individual. So it's focused on personal responsibility, it's focused on being independent, focused on your family, and not relying too much on the larger society, that the role of government is really interfering with our personal lives and our individual freedom. This is sort of it's our default. It's sort of where our society often teaches us about who's accountable and who's responsible for solving our social problems. From the perspective of social justice and a systemic change, we really want to broaden that frame from the individual or portrait frame to more of a landscape frame. So everyone who's on this call is working with organizations that are trying to address large social issues that are multifaceted, that are really systemic problems, where the individual has a role to play, of course, but we really need to look at the systems and the structures that are impacting individuals' lives and that are far outside an individual's control. So we're talking about the values of shared responsibility, of working on something in a group, we're in this together versus you're on your own. This idea of duty to the collective good, that we're not just responsible for ourselves, but that we are responsible for our social structure as a whole. And the view of government from this perspective is more one of protection rather than interference. And so when we think about competing values, these are sort of the way that the two value systems, if you think about them as competing against each other, typically land either on one side or the other. Obviously, there's quite a bit of gray area, but this is one way to look at this idea of competing values. And so we're going to spend a few minutes going through some examples of competing values and how to broaden your frame from a portrait frame to a landscape frame. So the first way that we want to do that is to ask you your opinions on a few different quotes that we have here, and the values that you hear in these messages. So the first message is from economist Milton Friedman, and he says, the only way that has ever been discovered to have a lot of people cooperate together voluntarily is through the free market, and that's why it's so essential to preserving individual freedom. So we can hear a number of different values in this message, and we'd love just to hear what do you take away from this message in terms of values? If you were to hear someone say this, what could you assume that their personal values are? We're going to take that one first, and then we'll move on to the next one. When you hear Milton Friedman's quote up there, what are the values that come to mind for you? Maybe they're not your values, or maybe they are, but what are some of the values that we hear in the message specifically? I'm seeing some ideas come through. Individualities come up a couple of times. Personal control. We can only collaborate if there's something in it for me. Okay, so sort of the looking out for yourself before anyone else. The invisible hand of self-interest. More about holding the individual accountable. So you can see that this is really the idea that, you know, we're coming at our social system really from a place of lots and lots and lots of individuals looking out for themselves and coming together to make sure that each individual is taken care of, but on an individual basis rather than on a collective basis. So if we move on to the next quote from Delane Easton, who says, "Shame on a state with Cadillac prisons and jalopy schools." What do we think she's suggesting with this quote? What would if we were to have a meal with Delane Easton, what could we assume are the values that she's bringing to the conversation? So one person is saying value equals investment in education, that's valuable, that's important to our society.
Somebody else is saying funding inequity.
Thank you. Yes, how are we distributing funds? And are we doing it in a way that is in the public interest? And that's what someone just says right here. Public funds are not benefiting the public. Our budget is a statement of, oh, I just lost it. Our budget is a statement of values, and California isn't investing in kids or education equitably. How we spend our money shows our values, and money to prisons rather than schools is shameful. I appreciate this particular insight, this idea of shame, that we hold ourselves accountable to a certain standard, and if we're not meeting those standards, then we have something to be ashamed of, that we should be behaving differently. And someone else is pointing out the importance of the government role in citizens' life. So that's also very important. So great. So this is just a quick exercise to sort of get to that idea of competing values, the individual versus the collective good. And so when we think about the values of our target audience and the people who are in positions of power to make change, that's particularly important because we want to know, when we're talking to someone, we want to understand where they're coming from. And we can't assume that there's such a thing as a blank slate, that we have to understand that everyone we're talking to, that every target that we have for a policy change goal is going to come at our issue with their own experience, their own perspective, their own values. And so we just wanted to give a few examples on some issues that are common in the work that we do with grantees around the state. So we have a few examples here. This first one is on obesity. So again, it comes at this from the individual perspective. So this is the left-hand side column versus the social perspective, or the societal perspective. So if we're talking about the issue of obesity, who's responsible for addressing this issue? Well, parents should be held accountable. If this is from the individual perspective, this is really a parental issue. Personal choices, that people are just not taking care of themselves. They're not exercising enough. People are too linked to their technology. They're too sedentary. Or they're not disciplined enough to get out and move their body. So these are all things that are related to the individual. When we think about broadening that perspective from the individual or the portrait to the landscape frame, we can see all sorts of issues within the systems and structures of our society that affect obesity as well. So the countless advertisements that we see in junk food marketing, especially to children. How easy or difficult is it for someone to access healthy food? Do they have public transportation to get them to a grocery store that sells fresh fruits and vegetables? Are there safe places for them to get physical activity out of doors? near their home? Or do they even have time for that, either in the school day or after work? And then what are some of the local, state, and federal policies that affect how active someone can be? If someone is living in a particularly urban environment, are there zoning laws that require parks to be every few miles, require access to open space, allow schools to be open after hours? All of those are systemic issues that have nothing to do with the individual and that are far outside the individual's control. So those would be some of the issues that we would want to think about and some of the values that we want to hone in on when we're thinking about addressing these issues sort of from that portrait perspective. Here is an example on the issue of immigration, looking at this concept of us versus them. So we all are here in this country. We deserve the best, and the people who are coming in from other places are just looking for free handouts, or they're criminals, or these are people who are taking jobs or making wages be too low, versus more of the community perspective, broadening that perspective to the landscape, that we can look at immigration as people who are coming here looking for a better life, who are contributing to our society through their work, through their culture, through their values, through the dollars and cents and taxes, or dedication to family, or eager for citizenship, so who appreciate the values and the culture that exists in this country, and they want to participate in that. So again, looking at this from the individual perspective versus the social or the landscape perspective. And so what we want to do is infuse all of our messages with these components, or with these elements of the landscape perspective. So Shadai is going to lead us through the components of a message and help us understand where does this idea of values belong when we're thinking about the structure of our messaging. So Shadai, I'll pass it back to you.
Thank you. So we're here to talk about message development too, and we want to give you some concrete takeaways for you to work on your messages. So we're going to have some time to practice, but we want to go step by step on what are the components of a message. So this is kind of like a formula where you plug in the answers, and then you will work on the refining the language and how to make it all sound pretty and concise. But the most important thing is that you think through the answers to these questions. So when we're talking about our statement of concern, we need to state clearly what's wrong. And like I said earlier, the way that we say what the problem is usually leads into the solution. So in the examples that Ingrid was giving earlier, if we're saying parents are not giving healthy foods to their kids, then the solution will be, well, then let's have parents do that, as opposed to us saying, well, school lunches have junk food and they're poor in nutritional value. Then we can work on something that is more systemic and more environmental change in schools that is going to affect the same issue that we're trying to solve, but the way that we talk about the problem is going to lead us into the solution. So that's something important to think about. And then the other thing that I wanted to say about this is that usually advocates and people working in this field spend a lot of time talking about the issue and talking about the problem, and it makes sense because we are passionate and we are very knowledgeable of the problems that we're seeing in our society. But that's proven to lose our audience, so we don't want to lose our audience. And also in message testing, research has shown that also people respond much better when there is a clear solution. It is more hopeful and people know exactly what to do. So we want to shift that ratio and spend more time talking about the solution rather than the problem. So that's something really important for everyone to think about. And now inserting the values, that's the number 2 component, and you can use them in any order, but just going down the list. why does this matter? Why is this work that you're doing? Why is this issue that you're working on important? Why does it matter? And all of you shared all of your messages earlier about fairness, about social justice, about family, and all of these drive you to do the work that you do, and really make people your choices or the work that you do, the things that you do are really deeply rooted in your values. So the same thing with the people that we are trying to influence, and the same thing with the target audience that we're trying to send these messages to. So that's why it's really important that we infuse this with values, and that we connect with our audience at the values level. Then we want to talk about our policy objective. What should we be doing? What should be done? What is the solution that you are proposing? And then it will be in alignment on how you phrase the problem. So make sure that you include this information, and then that you include your target audience. So who is this person that is going to make this change happen? Who is that person with that decision-making power? And if you add a timeline, then that's bonus points. So like I said earlier, this may be formulaic, but as long as you answer these questions, then you can work on your words and your language and how you're going to phrase it, and how long and how short, depending on whether you're going to use it on social media or whether you're going to use it on a report. But the most important thing is that there are answers to these questions, and that you are connecting with your audience at the values level. Now, I'm going to show you a couple of examples where we're using a very similar message, but we are tapping into slightly different values to show that you can tweak your messages depending on who you're talking to or how you're going to use the message. So the first one is, and I'm going to read it, so I apologize for that, but so this says, children are healthier when their communities provide healthy food. But when neighborhood stores don't have a selection of healthy food, people simply can't feed their families the way that they want, and their health suffers. It is not fair that people in our neighborhood have plenty of access to liquor stores and junk food, but have to take 2 buses to go to the grocery store to sell fresh produce, and that's why we need the city council to work with us to attract a new market. So here in this message, we are answering the questions that we talked about in the previous slide. So we are leading with values. We're talking about children and health and community. So those are our first opening words. We're defining the problem very succinctly. And then we are going into why it matters. So here we're highlighting an equity issue. It is not fair that people have to go take 2 buses and they go really far to eat healthy food. It is not. It is a matter of equity. And then we are very succinctly too saying who is our target and what we want them to do. We want to attract a new market. So this is one example on how to answer those questions in our messages. I'm going to show you another example that is going to show you a different value. So we're starting off again with the same children, health, community. That's kind of like an overarching value that everybody can feel connected to. But then when we're talking about why it matters in the 3rd paragraph, we're talking about there's a great opportunity, a business opportunity for grocery owner to bring their products to our neighborhood. It would be good for the bottom line and good for our health. So why it matters, we're talking about health, but we're also talking about businesses. And so that might appeal to a different person depending on who we're talking to. That might be appealing to them. So that's why it's important that we incorporate those values and we know who we are talking to. And then the rest of the message is the same, and you're just plugging in and tweaking it a little bit depending on who you're talking to and connecting with the values. So last time we did this, people wanted to have time to practice. So we want you to have time to practice, and also we want to give you feedbacks on the messages that you work on. So Ingrid's going to lead us into a little activity where you are going to develop your messages.
Thanks so much, Shaddai. So as Shaddai said, we wanted to make sure that you have some time to practice what we are sharing with you here today and get some questions answered. And one of the things that Shaddai said that I think is really important and worth repeating is that you want to make sure that you're thinking about each audience individually and developing a message for that specific audience. So while the two messages that she showed you started out similarly, they were customized for a particular audience depending on what that audience's values were. So just as a reminder, the first one was on the value of equity, or the second one was on the value of health and business. So when we break this down, this message development structure, we're thinking about these four components. One is what's wrong, so what's the problem that you're trying to solve? Why does it matter, and that's the value issue. What should be done, and who has the power to make the change? So what should be done is your policy goal, or if it's a funding request, it's the dollar value. You're looking for funding from X organization to do the work that you're looking to do. Who has the power to make the change? Being as explicit as you can about who's responsible and who can actually influence or impact the change that you're seeking. So again, if you come up with a message that answers these four questions, you're well on your way to having a strong, effective message that you can then tweak for any audience. So what we'd like you to do for the next minute or two or three is come up with a message. You can jot it down next to your computer and then type it into the chat box if you want to share it with the group. We'd love to hear what you've come up with, and we can also give you some feedback on that. So the way to do that would be to answer these four questions. What's wrong? What's the problem that you're trying to solve? Why does it matter? Again, what's the value that you that resonates with you or that you think will resonate with your target audience, more importantly? What should be done, and who has the power to make the change?
And I see a question in the chat, and so we'll have a little bit of time at the end to answer questions. So we see it. Just letting you know.
So we'll give everyone a few minutes to work on this and just sort of stay quiet on our end. One thing we wanted to let you know, though, is that these message development exercises, when we do them in live trainings, they take a really long time. And when we think about the messages that we're working on with groups over a long period of time, they go through revision after revision after revision. So obviously we're asking you for a big, we're putting you under a lot of pressure to ask you to come up with something in just a few minutes, and we recognize that we're probably not going to get perfect prose, and that's okay. The idea is just that you're practicing incorporating these four different elements into your message. So just to give you a little prompt, I'm just putting into the chat box a sample message, one of them that Shaddai mentioned in her examples earlier. So you can see how it breaks down from problem, why it matters, the solution, and who has the power to make the change or the target. You can look at that as you're working on your messages if you'd like. And if there's someone who's feeling brave and wants to share, you could share it with just the panelists if you want us just to look at it, or all of the participants. Okay, we have one example that Heather has shared from an upcoming publication with BMSG, or from BMSG. Many of our young men of color have had to deal with challenges no young person should have to face. After decades of disinvestment, many of our African American and Latino youth are living in communities without the resources and services needed to prevent violence. So that's the problem. In fact, violence is the #1 cause of death among young African Americans here in the city they call home. When the City Council votes on the upcoming Violence Prevention Ordinance, it's imperative that they approve funding for violence prevention outreach workers. So it's calling on the City Council. They've identified their target, and it's said exactly what they need them to do, which is approve funding for violence prevention. These outreach workers connect with individuals most at risk of experiencing or perpetuating violence. They are changing lives, making our entire community strong and healthy for years to come. So there's the infusion of the value, creating a strong and healthy community, and also sustainably strong for years to come. This is not just a Band-Aid fix. All young people in our city deserve the opportunity to realize their fullest potential and to simply live. That's why we are calling on the City Council to safeguard the resources our outreach workers need. Again, repeating who the target audience is and what you want them to do. And Heather also makes an important point of flipping the order, that we ask you these questions on the slide: what's wrong, why does it matter, what should be done, and who has the power to make the change. We ask them in that order. It doesn't mean that your message has to be in that order. You could have a message that's in, that calls on the accountable body first and foremost, and includes your value at the end. What we typically encourage is that you start your message with a frame from the environmental or the landscape perspective, that you get people sort of come along with you on this idea that, sure, individuals have a role to play, but really it's the social structures and systems that are at work that we need to be thinking about that affect people in such a larger way.
So we want to hear from you. If you have written a message, even if it's not perfect, we want to hear about it.
So I appreciate the statement from one of our participants who may share some concern that everyone shares, which is it's hard to be put on the spot. It's hard to have this exercise given to you kind of as the last minute when you might be thinking about lots of different issues that your organization works on, and that's just fine. We also would be happy to hear from you, individually after the webinar. We do have a message coming in, a sample message coming in. Thank you for sharing, Allison. 64% of Bay Area public school students are vulnerable to hunger and poor diet. Their caregivers struggle to balance the high cost of rent in our area with the cost of healthy food. Given this climate of food insecurity among Bay Area families, it is not right that the Oakland Unified School District has cut their vital after-school supper program, meaning that their students are guaranteed even less access to healthy food at school. OUSD and its governing bodies must reinstate its supper program to make sure that every child in our community can be fueled to learn and grow. This is an excellent example. Thank you, Allison, for sharing. I think it has all the components that we've been talking about, which is identifying the problem that hunger is an issue among more than half of Bay Area public school students, and that one of the problems with providing healthy food is that rents are so high, it's hard to balance the cost of rent and healthy food. So what do we want to be done? We want Oakland Unified School District to take some responsibility of continuing to provide healthy meals within the school system. And the value is that children inherently are a value that we all share. Ensuring that children are getting a proper education and that proper nutrition is part of that education. Those are also some values that I heard in this message. So did you have anything else that you might want to add or thoughts to share?
Yeah, I think the fairness component is important, and the equity component. So we're saying it's not right that OUSD is doing this. So what is the right thing to do? We're shaming them in a way too, saying what is the right thing to do, and also the equity component, like it's the high cost and of rent and the high cost of healthy foods is affecting a lot of our fellow Bay Areans. There's also the Bay Area, pride, or the place of pride that can also be a value, like really people feel attached to their hometown or to wherever they're from, and appealing to that, it's also a good way to infuse values.
Thanks so much for sharing that.
Mm-hmm.
I know that it can be intimidating to share these ideas in sort of a public venue like this, so we don't want to put pressure on anyone. We could move on to the question and answer segment of the presentation if that would be most helpful to folks. We know that oftentimes people have really specific questions, and then we can tell you a little bit more about what other opportunities are available through the grant that we have through the California Wellness Foundation.
And if you still want to add in your messages, we can still give you feedback because we found that that's really useful for people to hear feedback on the messages that they're working on. So in terms of questions and answers, again, you can just type them in. You're all familiar with the chat box. And I do want to address the question that was posed earlier, I believe also by Allison, that is talking about how education nonprofits and direct service organizations best engage with policy. That is a very good question, and we know that a lot of the times when you're doing direct service and you're interfacing with the population that you're trying to help, it's hard to make time or to focus on bigger policy. So what I wanted to say about this is that it is important to go back to the overall strategy and to think through what is the problem that you are trying to solve. Who has the power to make that change? What is the best solution? And sometimes solutions may be many solutions, and you have to pick one. But if you go back to the layers of strategy, and I think Heather sent out a link, that's one way that you can identify what kind of policy you can get involved. And obviously policy can go up to the legislature level, but it can also be school policy or local policy or other types of rules and policies, not necessarily going up to Sacramento, but that's also doable and important. So yeah, to answer that question, how can you best engage with policy, is going back to your overall strategy and really see what is the one change that you want to make at the policy or at the environmental level or the big picture level. I hope that's helpful. Do we have any other questions or any other messages that people want to share? I guess I would say also for the person, Anna, who said that needs more time, that totally makes sense in terms of developing a message. And so it would also require going back to the overall strategy, and sometimes we can see all the things that are wrong, all the things that are happening, and we want to we may feel inclined to do something, but we don't know because there's so much going on. And so there's something else that we say at BMSG, which can be strategic and comprehensive at the same time. So you do have to pick the one thing that you're going to work on and then go through the steps of answering those questions so that you can develop a message, or that you can work on advancing some sort of policy or some sort of systems change. But those questions can be good guiding starting points. Okay. So we have a couple questions from Asha saying, should we develop a different message for each target audience? Sometimes the why varies based on the audience, and that's completely true. You don't necessarily have to change the entire message, and like we saw in the example, you can switch or swap a few words or just a component of the message depending on who you're talking to. But the components of what's the problem and what's the solution and who is responsible for making that change or who you're holding responsible, that's not going to change. What's going to change is the why. The why is important, and that's when you want to appeal to your audience. So you can change that a little bit. Let's see. Can educating people about nutrition and encouraging to vote with a dollar about what is stocked at their store is considered a PSE change? If their spending habits change and their local stores change, to me that it seems like kind of grassroots environmental change. Yes, and when we are trying to educate and mobilize people, we are still focusing on individual behavior. So we are still have to depend on individuals making changes or making a specific action. And so when we're trying to create system change from an upstream perspective, our target will change. Our target will not be the public or the participants in a program. The target will be somebody who has the power to make a very specific vote in city council, or the power to make a rule change in the school or the school district. So it is a little bit different. The messaging component in the end, you can still use it like Ingrid said in the beginning, but when we're trying to make upstream change, we want to make systems change and target those who can influence those systems as opposed to relying on individuals. I don't know if you want to respond more or add more, Ingrid, or should we move on?
No, I think that everything that Shadai said is good and thorough, and Heather's adding in the chat box just the summary that store owners are the primary target and consumers would be the secondary target. So I think the clarification there is even if consumers are affecting the change with their dollar power, really the targets are the store owners, because they're the ones who are going to change what's being stocked in the store and essentially changing that, the environment of the store.
So we have 3 minutes, and we'll see if there's any more questions coming in, but if not, I'll pass it back to Ingrid so she can talk a little bit more about next steps for all of you. But if there are any more questions, you have 2 more minutes.
Thanks, Shadai. So the next step is actually pretty exciting. Through this grant that we have through the California Wellness Foundation, we have the opportunity to work with any grantee that's interested in some more in-depth customized technical assistance. So what we can do is, if you get in touch with us, you can email me directly at the email on your screen, and let us know that you're interested in some follow-up technical assistance that would be just with us and your organization. It could be with one individual or a number of people. And there's also a place to put your name if you are interested in some follow-up information. We have a survey that you'll receive after the end of this webinar, and there'll be a place there where you can let us know that you're interested in some follow-up information. And so between now and the end of June of next year, we have the opportunity to work with folks. It's at no cost to the organization. It's all being funded through the California Wellness Foundation. And we'd love to talk to you if we are a good fit with some of the needs that you have in your organization. So please be in touch. Here are the emails for both myself and Shadai, and also ways to find us on social media. And we appreciate you being with us today. We should have some more webinars coming up early in the coming year, as well as some in-person trainings. So please keep your eye out for more information and opportunities with DMSG. And thanks for being with us today.
Thank you, everyone. And like Heather said in the chat box, you will get a survey. And if you can fill it out, that'll be really, really helpful for us to improve our webinars and also just show and see how this is helpful for all of you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.